As a technician, when you become frustrated or you have a conflict with one of your colleagues, you are in your own bubble and you see what's going on around you. When you are a leader, you see the big picture.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing in industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Dina Budacan, Central Sterile Processing Department Manager and Decontamination Lead for one of Ireland's leading private healthcare facilities. Dina has a Bachelor in Science and Sterile Services Management and is a strong believer that everything can be achieved as long as there is passion, dedication, and focus. In her case, that's patient safety. And Hank, I know you reached out to Dina because she wrote an article on the topic that we're going to be discussing with her today. But I know that our listeners are going to hear that passion and her dedicated focus on patient safety, which really is the central place that we all come from when we support the sterile processing industry.
Yeah, Justin, and I reached out to her too because this is a topic that is just real life. We talk about a lot of things that are highly technical and kind of high-level philosophy, but this is another one of those. It just comes down to throwing a bunch of different people in the same room every single day with a lot of stressors. What do you think is going to happen? Well, frustration and annoyance is going to happen. So I wanted to talk to someone who has thought about that and the implication it has not only on the team, but to your point, on the patient. So I'm really excited to put this conversation out there in the industry and hopefully start more conversations around how we can address annoyances in a proactive way.
All right. Well, this is going to be a good one. We'll be right back after a short break with Dina Budacan.
You're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Dina Budacan, Central Sterile Processing Department Manager and Decontamination Lead for one of Ireland's leading private healthcare facilities. And Dina, we see you as such a big supporter of Beyond Clean, especially on LinkedIn. Your name is constantly popping up with comments. You're so engaged in the community, and we're really excited to have you on today.
Thanks for having me, guys, and giving me the chance to be on your podcast.
Today's topic is going to be really interesting. And, Hank and I joke sometimes when we're hanging out and talking about the podcast about how I really like all of the soft skills conversations. And Hank really loves the data and the concrete. And so I think he did this podcast just extra special for me because this is definitely in my wheelhouse. Just talking about how not to get annoyed in sterile processing. And, annoyance comes from doing things repetitively. And then there's this whole human side where people are bound to make mistakes or do things in the department as you work with each other. It's just human nature. And so sometimes those annoyances bubble up and become much bigger things and really can be a culture killer if it gets out of control. And so I'm really excited because this is the kind of stuff I really love talking about, is the human nature of the business. So why don't we just start? You wrote an article. Can you talk about the article and why you wrote it?
I'm working in sterile processing since 2015. And along the years, I had the chance to meet colleagues from other organizations and share experiences with everyone. Everyone felt at least once the frustration feeling in their career. At the time, I was a promoter of CSSD and what we were all doing there. And I felt that there is a lot said about the technicality of the job, but not so much about its importance and how to deal with issues while they are still small, how to keep yourself motivated and how to set expectations from yourself rather than setting expectation from your colleagues or your management. Now, after becoming a leader in the industry and seeing and having a bigger and broader picture of the job, I wanted to address my thoughts to my fellow technicians who feel the same way as we all felt at the beginning of sterile processing journey. And then the article became live and viral.
Now, you said frustrating, and you described that frustration. So let's start there. Like, why do you think there's so much potential for frustration when you're working in sterile processing?
Well, most of the CSSD departments are multicultural departments. We have people from around the world with different perception, different culture. And when everything adds up, that will make the dynamic and the culture of our department, different beliefs and expectations towards the job. And when you do such a repetitive job as the sterile processing job, it's so easy to fire up conversations.
I know, Dina, we've talked a lot about culture on this podcast, but typically when we talk about culture, it's kind of the business culture, positive culture versus negative culture, team building culture versus kind of independent, selfish culture, maybe. But you brought up an important point that sometimes these larger cultures, these multi-culture departments can also lead into those frustrating or annoying experiences. So I'm just wondering if you can flesh that out a little bit more for us, because you're totally right. In our industry, even in the U.S., we see a ton of diversity in these departments, not just Americans working in it, but we have multicultural departments all over our country. And I'm assuming, to your point, that it's the same across the globe.
Yes, it is. And when we are looking for staff, we are looking for experienced staff, educated staff, and then we are looking how well the interview process went. And only later, as the staff progress in their new role, we see the personality and the background they are bringing into our departments. And then we have to deal with the changes which are happening in our departments. So some people will be outspoken, some will be more reserved. And then this will change the dynamic of the department and the conflict itself. I can give an example. If I'm a reserved person, but I'm working with someone who is outspoken and will tell me something, I can easily get offended. That's how I will describe the best by giving this example.
And so you gave a little bit of your background, which I think is a very important point, that you have worked not only in the leadership perspective, but also as a technician. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how those frustrating experiences or the annoying experience differ from if you're annoyed as a technician, you only have so many options. If you're annoyed as a leader, you also only have so many options, but they're different options. Give us a little insight around those two categories.
As a technician, when you become frustrated or you have a conflict with one of your colleagues, you are in your own bubble and you see what's going on around you. When you are a leader, you see the big picture. You have a better understanding on the reason why such thing happened or why things went in certain way. As a technician, you are limited. You only see what's happening on the floor or on your own experience. And I think from a technician point of view, the conflict will be a little bit personal. As a leader, you need to look at a professional level and don't look at the person who did something wrong or become frustrated or was given out about something. Just look at the behavior and the process itself. It's a little bit different approach.
Yeah, so that's a theme. That is a theme that keeps coming up on these podcasts about the balance of the process versus the people. In our previous conversation that we had with Gordon Allen recently, was talking about quality implications of that balance, but today we're talking about behaviors and attitudes. But it's the same. You're right. Because someone had a bad day, for instance, to look at that from a leadership perspective and just blame that person themselves for having a bad day and how they acted without taking a step back and saying what led to that experience. I remember from your article a great story where you described a technician leaving on a Friday evening, expecting everything to be cleaned up by the weekend, ready to go Monday morning when you come in. And then what happens when you walk in at 7 o'clock in the morning on Monday? It's a disaster. And the first reflex from just a normal person is, what did my team members do to me? What the heck just happened? And that's a reality, right, for us.
Yes, it is. And I think everybody experiences it, not just in sterile processing. I think it's happening in multiple organizations when you have expectation from your colleagues. You expect them to help you. If you help them, they will help you. Or your manager, you did something extra on your own initiative and you expect maybe a day off or a pay rise, or, we all set some expectations. And I think the expectations lead to frustrations.
So what is the impact of that? As we were leading into the interview, I was talking about how this can have, that frustration can really bubble up and then wind up having some really long-term impacts on culture, not just short-term. And even talked about the leadership, taking that non-personal, very professional, process-oriented step back and kind of looking at the whole. And sometimes with good leadership, you can kind of get through that as a bump in the road, right? You just kind of navigate it, things calm down. But sometimes these things start to compound and pile up and pile up and pile up. And when they do, where do we see that? And we talked about this being more of a soft kind of skill conversation, but I think it shows up in the data. To Hank's love of the industry and information, I think we do start to see it objectively in the metrics. Don't you agree?
Yeah, I think it can affect the productivity, the workload, the whole dynamic of the department, and it can take the focus of the staff from the main goal and organization's goal.
That's a really good point too. And focus from the patient, right? Because the patient is where the focus is. Anybody who gets, I call it the bug or the passion for this industry, they really center on the patient safety piece and really making sure that every patient gets that standard of care, which is a big buzzword in the industry, is standard of care. And so when you talk about that shift in focus, do you feel like it can kind of be catchy too? Like once one person starts to have that self-focus in the dynamic, do other people start to fall into that? I mean, it's almost like dominoes to me.
Yeah, well, especially if they share the same beliefs. So if one staff members will say, well, I had a terrible wash shift, and that's the second time when it's happening. And then the second one will say, well, yeah, that happened to me as well. And then suddenly you have two having the same belief, and then three more will join, and then you have a problem.
You just described something. We were talking about the multicultural departments, and there's belief systems as a result of what culture people come from. But I never even really thought about these microcosm belief systems, right? That start to develop, like third shift never does this, right? And then all of a sudden we've made this blanket statement, and the people on the shift start to believe that. And how interesting it is when somebody moves from one shift that's getting scapegoated to another, how they actually change their belief system based on which shift they work. Can you think of any other belief system related concepts like that one, where maybe there's dynamics on shifts or there's dynamics about decontam, like everybody who's working in decontam? Are there others that are common that come up?
Well, the most common is they versus us, OR or theater, as we call it in Ireland, and CSSD. That's a very common one. And I think it's very important in the induction training for theater staff and CSSD staff to be a visit in the departments and get an insight of their job, because that's the closest department to sterile processing. And I think will be nice if everybody will understand everyone's job and priorities, and then will reduce the friction.
It goes back to what Justin was saying too around the shifts, is there's an assumption if you've only ever worked second shift and you come in at the end of first shift and they seem a little busy, but there's not a lot of work that they've got on their plates. But then at the end of second shift, you see all of these trays that you still have left over. And so you begin to think, Is first shift just not working? Is their shift easier? That feeds into that assumption of we're doing more work, or the work that we're doing is harder.
The martyr syndrome, Hank.
Right. Well, the same thing happens for our customers, to Dina's point. If it's the operating room, looking at sterile processing, like, oh, guys, how hard can it be? Like, you're just down there washing the instruments, packaging the instruments, sending it back. But then when you don't do that to their standard, then that frustrating and annoyance starts between, but then sterile processing gets annoyed at the operating room theater. Like, guys, you have no idea how hard this is. We're actually trying to do a good job. And because of all these other complexities, we just can't get there.
It's very true.
To that point, Dina, the problem and challenge has been outlined here. We know the issues around frustration. We understand the implications for that frustration on the staff morale, on the potential quality output and everything else. But what's the solution? How have you seen your teams change that interdepartment cultural dynamic to be positive influence on the staff and customers as opposed to a negative influence?
I think raising awareness, communicate how important everyone's job is. There is no job more important than the other. There is no competition. We are going at work to achieve something, to make sure the patient has everything what he needs and everything is at the best standard of care for his safety. Then these visits in the department to get an insight from other people's jobs and priorities and understand that there are variables in healthcare sector and you cannot control everything. You can control a shift. You can control the roster and make sure, okay, if someone got a morning shift, tomorrow let's have an evening shift or the next week to be as fair as possible. But you can't control the workload. You can't decide, well, I'm going to take care of 2 patients. You're going to take care of 2 patients. And then if it's the third one, who's going to take that patient?
Right.
So there is no fair in the workload. And everybody needs to understand that.
There's a saying from Teddy Roosevelt where people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And then I think about walking a day in somebody else's shoes. You started that answer off with awareness. And I almost feel like you can build in those 2 concepts. And just occasionally, like you hear about when somebody gets hired in the operating room, having them spend a week in sterile processing, and vice versa, having sterile processing technicians shadow in the operating room so they can just see the high level of attention, focus, and subsequent anxiety. As soon as something kind of gets out of place, there's like a vibe in the operating room that gets disrupted, and that can attack at confidence, right? And then that has an impact on the patient as well. And so have you seen any strategies about sort of making sure that awareness of other people's jobs or other people's shifts, or I realize not everybody can be a leader in the way that you said you stand back and you see that whole process, but what are some things that you can do for technicians so that they can get that broader perspective and not be so siloed in their own day-to-day?
Well, awareness days would be something nice to have in the departments, a day in a year when everybody will be invited in sterile processing and we can go through what we do, to be known, to have the chance to say what we are doing and that we are there and we are doing a phenomenal job. And this, I'm saying this for everybody across the globe. It's not about the department where I work or the department I've been to. It's about everybody. I think every sterile processing department feels the same way. Showing up and saying, well, actually, I'm doing this and I'm responsible for this, and be proud of what we are doing rather than stay there and complain and always feel frustrated. Oh, they don't forget, they forgot about us, or they don't know who we are.
I want to take you back, Tina, too, to comment about leadership. And even though, like we've been talking about, do these other customers, operating room theater, do they understand who we are? Does the public understand who we are? And even between the shifts, do the shifts understand each other? But I think another common frustration is that separation between technicians and leadership, when technicians feel like leaders don't understand what they're going through. And they feel like, oh, well, if they really knew what we were going through, then we wouldn't have this policy, or they wouldn't schedule us this way. And, sometimes that's true, right? So I don't want to discount that. But how do you speak to that dynamic, or how would you encourage leaders to overcome that frustration that their staff may have, where they feel like you just don't understand us and our job?
Maybe explaining them a little more why a decision was made in such a way, or why they end up doing 3 wash shifts instead of 2. Explaining them, asking their help and input. If the department is going through challenging times with hiring new staff and training them, asking the staff with more experience to support and have any ideas or training ideas to help. I think the communication between management and staff is very important. And some managers might say, well, I'm not gonna justify front of my technician, but it's not justify, it's explaining and giving them a bit of more insight of what you're doing and why the decisions were made in such a way.
Yeah, that's huge. That question of justification, because if a manager or leader is not self-confident, it can be very scary for them to have to explain themselves. And I've seen a lot of leaders fail where they feel like, I've got the title. I think we even talked about this on our previous show, maybe the interview that we did with Sharon Combs. And she mentioned that idea that once you're sitting in the manager's office, you feel like if you walk out on the floor and you say something, everyone should be like, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, I'll get to it right away. And then you become frustrated when there's anybody to question your decision. But you're absolutely right. You have to be willing to communicate the why behind those decisions, or you're just going to feed into that frustration and that annoyance of the staff to feel like, well, they're just making decisions based on what they prefer, not the real life reality of our departments or our staffing, etc. So that's a fantastic point. I did want to ask you, though, as we kind of move to the end of this interview, what to do in situations where the culture may be too far gone, where there's been so many years of frustration and irritation and annoyance, maybe between the shifts or between the two departments, between the operating room theater and sterile services. How do you even begin to untangle that, either as a leader or as a technician who just happens to be in the middle of everything?
The culture is important in shaping the practice and performance across the board in all departments. When the culture is too far gone, it means a change must be done. It is very important to pass the message to the staff, to your technician, that this might be just a job to pay bills, an opportunity to socialize away from family problems, kids, issues. But for that scared patient waiting in the waiting room for a surgery who will change his life is a unique experience. As healthcare professional, is in our own hands how good will be his experience. Everyone must be on the same page, and any distraction from focus should be minimized. It's a taught job. It's not for everybody. Not everybody can work in sterile processing, or not everybody can be a healthcare professional. You are all in or not. And if you are not all in, you should consider a relocation or perhaps another job. If the issues would be around the process or the policy, I think I would consider a refresher training, additional information to help the technician to get through his limitation or difficulties towards the job and make him understand and help him to perform as required. I strongly believe that if every time we go to work and we think about those whose lives depend on us all doing the job right, frustration will fade in comparison to the appreciation feeling of being part of the team who contribute to the patient journey. That is more important than any issue related to job allocations, to who has more easy shift, more wash shift, who is checking, who is not checking.
And I think another thing is just getting the transparency out there, because like a lot of times when that's happening, everybody's having all their little side conversations and they're feeding in and you almost have to like bring everybody together and be like, this has got to come out on the table. We have to work through it. And then you kind of have everybody there and refocus them back on that patient safety. Like, this is our job. Our job isn't to sit here and create this dynamic. We've all got to come together and heal right now as a team and get our focus back on why we're here. And if we can't do that, we're going to impact people's lives. Like, you've got to raise that mission back up, because what's happening is they're all operating in a very narrow, myopic view, and they've lost their sense of mission. And I think it happens a lot, this too far gone culture. There's a reason why the leaders get fired in those situations. And it doesn't even necessarily mean that the leader was incompetent or whatnot, right? But sometimes what the organization is looking at, I'm not saying that this is always the right thing. I'm just saying sometimes the organization says, we just need a new leader because the team isn't focused on the bigger mission. And without a change, we may not be able to accomplish that. So yeah, to your point, I don't think you get rid of lots and lots of people in the department. That would just make things so much worse, so much more quickly. But there is a reason why, when you start looking up the chain, why the leaders take the fall in those scenarios. And sometimes, may have an effective leader, but they just have a few negative champions in the department that are just going to prevent that leader from ever being able to reset the focus. So Dina, this was a great interview. I really enjoyed having you on. I'm sure you felt like it went super fast. Is there anything you want to add before we kind of wrap up the conversation?
I would like to thank you for the chance to be part of this podcast, to thank Hank because he made possible the delivery of my most wanted book.
My pleasure. I'm glad you could finally get a copy. That's great.
Yes, it's really interesting. It's nice to see that passionate people talk about sterile processing, and the message is out there, and podcast and seminars, webinars, information is there. We just need to have the willingness to listen. It's more information than it used to be years back, and keep fighting dirty.
Well, thank you, Dina. You have done a great job of being part of that conversation, and appreciate you willing to talk to us about your insights and sharing your passion, which came through loud and clear. So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.
That was Dina Budacan, Central Sterile Processing Department Manager and Decontamination Lead for one of Ireland's leading private healthcare facilities. And Hank, you threw a shout out to last week's episode with Gordon Allen and also last season's episode with Sharon Combs. But at the very end there, I was thinking of when you said the why, our interview with Nestor Hernandez from way back in season 1. And I actually had a listener tell me the other day that they were a vendor representative and they had hired a new rep. And he was like, this is the one that I love playing when we bring new people onto the team so that they can really hear the why and the passion piece. But everything that we talked about, as far as getting everybody in that sort of budding negative culture shifted back on, it's all about the why. It is 100% about why we're here, and that sterile processing is an important job. It's critical, and getting everybody invested in that again, because when people lose sight of that, that's when the little things start to pop up and the frustrations really start to bubble over.
Yeah, Justin, that's where Dina started this interview, and that's where she ended it, with that people equation. How do we get the people focused on the right vision, not on the conflicts with their shift or their coworkers or their customers, but how do we keep them focused on the patient at the end of all this? And I love the fact that you brought up that interview with Nestor as well, because the question that stuck for me in that interview was when he came home and his daughter would ask, "Daddy, how many lives did you save today?" And that's really the question that we want all of our family members to ask us when we come home, not how frustrating was it, how many times you assigned to decontam, how irritating was the OR staff today, but if our families focus on that, that's something that we need to be focused on as well, and be reminding ourselves that every tray we touch, every load we load up in the autoclave, everything that we do in that department is contributing to something that's larger than ourselves and is bigger than our frustrations. And that's the big takeaway that I had on today's interview.
It's funny because you just reminded me of that Nestor interview and something that he said. And it kind of occurred to me that might have been one influencing factor for your decision to write the children's book with your wife, and really about building a career and an industry that we love and increasing that awareness. So I can see, at the very least, this theme that just keeps coming up over the many years. I think we're going to be done with our 4th year of recording this podcast pretty soon. This comes up over and over. It's never going away. It's central to what we do. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or by downloading our smartphone application for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.